with what may be the most significant rollback of a constitutional right by the Supreme Court in a generation, with a leaked draft opinion signaling most justices are planning to overturn Roe versus Wade, a majority, and remove a person's right to an abortion. So what now? And what's next? We're going to talk about the impact on millions of Americans who now may have to travel hundreds of miles for the procedure, and some new reaction coming in from pretty much everywhere. From President Biden, who wants Congress to do something about this, from Republicans who are furious about this leak, and from my conversation with a top official at Planned Parenthood who says this is going to disproportionately hurt women of color and women with less money. We're also following some other big headlines tonight, like on Brittney Griner, right? With the U.S. now considering the WNBA star wrongfully detained by Russia, putting some more muscle behind the push to try to bring her home. We're going to explain why that changed. And then some breaking news from the CDC saying, yes, you really should keep your mask on when you're taking public transportation, but it's still a recommendation, not a requirement. So will the Justice Department back them up? That's what we're asking. We're also taking you back to Southlake, Texas, where the fight over how kids learn about race and gender is front and center ahead of local elections this weekend. We're going behind the scenes on this in the backstory later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and tonight Americans want to know what could happen when or if the Supreme Court rolls back a constitutional right. Because it seems like that's where things are headed in the next couple months, that the justices will probably strike down Roe versus Wade. How do we know that? We can surmise that from what you're looking at on screen right now. This leaked draft opinion written by Justice Samuel Alito. We haven't actually obtained this draft ourselves. Politico first reported on it, but the Supreme Court today is confirming this document is authentic. It's not final, but it's real. And in it, Justice Alito calls Roe egregiously wrong from the start, adding that both it and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which upheld Roe, have inflamed the debate and deepened division. All across the country, you've got people out in the streets, supporters of and opponents of abortion rights. Check out what it's been like outside the Supreme Court today.
I did not bring my kids into this world to have their rights taken away.
The work of the pro-life movement is just beginning after Roe was overturned.
You also have President Biden now calling on Congress to make Roe v. Wade the law of the land.
If the rationale of the decision as released were to be sustained, a whole range of rights are in question. It's a fundamental shift in American jurisprudence.
Let me take a beat here to lay out a context check on just how big a deal this would be. First, if a majority of justices do side with Alito's opinion, and by the way, that's not set in stone. They could change their mind. Doesn't seem likely based on what we heard in oral arguments, but they could. It wouldn't make abortion illegal everywhere in the U.S., but it would allow each state to make its own rules. And check out this map. You've got more than half of states, 26 of them, which have already decided they'd ban or really restrict abortion if Roe were to fall. Planned Parenthood estimates those laws would cause more than 36 million people to lose abortion access, and women in those states would have to travel a pretty long ways to get the procedure if they can afford it. For nearly 1.5 million women of reproductive age, that's ages 15 to 49, a total ban in those states we're talking about would mean their nearest abortion provider is in California. For 9 million, Illinois. For 11 million, North Carolina would be their closest site. Anti-abortion activists have been fighting for this for decades. Even as polling shows, just 28% of Americans want Roe v. Wade overturned. We're going to take you live to an abortion rights rally in New York. And for the latest on all of this is unfolding on Capitol Hill in just a second. But I want to start here on set with Pete Williams, who I think has been up for 30 hours total at the moment with this big news. We've sort of laid out the context of this, Pete. We're going to talk in a second about what other rights could be affected and about this leak itself. But what does this mean if, in fact, in late June or early July, as anticipated, if it happens, Justice Alito and 4 other justices rule to overturn Roe?
Just as you said, it would no longer be the law of the land. States could decide for themselves. About half of them would ban it. About half of them would allow it. And no one should be surprised that that's what this draft says. It is a shocking thing that a Supreme Court draft opinion has been made public. That has never happened before. There have been leaks in the past from the Supreme Court, but nothing ever like this. And that is the astonishing thing here. Not what it says, because it was clear in the oral argument that there were 5 justices who were going to say that Roe v. Wade should be overturned. Clear,
but always a question until the decision comes out, right? In this instance, we're now seeing a look and we're now seeing a draft of it.
Well, we're one step closer.
Right. Part of the draft, and that has caught people's attention, is setting aside what this means for abortion rights and abortion access in this country. It's what about some other things, right? Because without getting too in the weeds, the decision cites this right to privacy, right? This sort of underpinning of Roe. And Justice Alito writes, the inescapable conclusion is that a right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and the traditions. He said, you know, on the contrary, an unbroken tradition of prohibiting abortion on pain of criminal punishment has persisted from the earliest days of common law until Roe in '73. What does this mean, right? Does this mean that other cases, Obergefell, right, which allowed same-sex marriage, for example, could be at risk too?
So two things about this. One is history and tradition. Are they deeply rooted? That is a long-standing test that the Supreme Court has used to assess whether there is a constitutional right. For assisted suicide, for example, to have a gun outside the home. Different answers on those questions. So that's why he cites that. Interestingly enough, while he attacks Roe v. Wade's finding of a right to privacy in the Constitution, twice he says in this opinion, but previous opinions that people have relied on to support Roe don't support Roe, but that doesn't mean that this decision says anything about them. So, for example, he says Loving v. Virginia, right, the interracial marriage, Obergefell, same-sex marriage, contraceptives, Griswold, the right to bodily integrity, to refuse medical procedures you don't want, all those things. He says we're not casting any doubt on those. Now, you know, was that something that he wrote in the first draft all by himself, or was that something that the other justices in conference insisted that it be there? Will it survive? I mean, that's one of the things to watch for when the decision ultimately comes
Because
out.
when you pull back the curtain, and you know this well, Pete, and you've explained it to us here on this show, there is back and forth that happens among the justices, among the clerks, potentially right up until the week that an opinion gets released, yes?
Yes, that's the process. This is a first draft. So what would happen is it would get circulated. The dissenters would write their
mark it up with their pens or whatever.
Right, and they would write their dissenting opinion, and then the things would be circulated back and forth, and individual justices could say, you know, I can't sign the thing that Politico has says first draft circulated to the other offices, but it doesn't say whether any of those other offices actually received them, and they may send it, you know, he may have drafted this by himself in his own chambers, and they have said, well, you know, I can join this if. And that is the process that goes on. Remember, the case was argued in December. The date on the first draft is February 10th. So this process takes a long time.
But this brings us to the leak itself, which you called, I think, extraordinary, unless I'm making that up from just a couple minutes ago.
Right.
It is extraordinary. And now it's going to be investigated, and the Chief Justice made that very clear. How does an investigation like that work? What does it mean?
I don't know that the court has any idea how an investigation like that works. This is not what the court's marshal normally does. The marshal has been given this assignment, and I frankly have no idea how she's going to proceed. I just can't overstate how corrosive this is within the court.
Explain that, because what does this mean for the institution from a legacy perspective? This
is an institution that is built on confidentiality and loyalty. Every incoming clerk gets told, you have to preserve the integrity and the confidentiality of what goes on here. Don't talk to people about what we're doing. Don't talk to journalists. It's a firing offense. A former Chief Justice used to say, it's zero tolerance for talking to reporters. That's how seriously they take this. Every law clerk understands this. That's why this leak is just so unimaginable, starters. Secondly, it's corrosive to the Supreme Court's reputation for integrity. You know, somebody's going to think, whichever side, it's either the liberals or the conservatives or whatever, that someone's trying to lobby the court indirectly by leaking this thing. That's not the way it's supposed to work. That's very damaging to the court's long-term integrity.
Pete Williams, we'll look for more from you tonight, I know, on Nightly News, and I'm sure tomorrow on Today as well. Appreciate it, Pete. Thanks for being with us.
You bet.
We've talked about some of what's happening right now with Pete. So what about what's next, right? I asked that question to the executive director of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund, Kelly Robinson. Here's what she laid out. You've got Democrats on the Hill now trying to make it into a law in Congress, right, codifying Roe. They just don't have the votes. So given that, what is next for you?
We've got to make sure that we're turning all the anger and fear that folks have into action. Just last night at the Court, there were over 1,000 people that turned out to protest. Because the reality is that even if the law changes in this country, people will still need access to abortion. All it does by putting these bans into place is make it more difficult for folks of color, for folks with low incomes, and for people.
But here's the thing. As we said, Democrats do not have the votes to do what they want to do, which is codify the provisions of Roe into law, even though that's exactly what this guy, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, says he wants to try to do ASAP. And at the state level, like in Michigan, where there's actually a law from 1931 that would ban abortion if Roe would be overturned. It obviously hadn't existed yet. Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's up for re-election, says she's going to keep fighting like hell, in her words, to ensure abortion remains safe and accessible in her state. For many Republicans, they're focusing on the leak itself. That's what we heard from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He said the leak was a lawless action that should be investigated and punished. Not every Republican agrees. Let me bring in Hallie Vitale on Capitol Hill for us. And Hallie, help us understand the political fight and where it goes from here. Because if, in fact, this draft opinion remains intact in late June, early July, whenever we find out when it becomes formal and final, the fight then goes from the judicial branch, right? There's sort of no more fight there. Executive branch can't do it. It goes to the legislative branch. There's not a consensus on the legislative branch on how to proceed. Explain that.
Yeah, exactly, because we can do just the basic math here, and you did it in the introduction here to this segment. Senate Democrats don't have the votes that they need to actually move forward on the bill that Schumer says he's going to bring to the floor. He's right when he says there's a new urgency around it. There's a lot of rage in this building right now for Democrats, but it just feels like there's no place for them to tangibly funnel that. There are discussions, and this happened today in their Democratic caucus meeting over lunch, there's discussions over whether or not the vote that Schumer brings to the floor is the Women's Health Protection Act in the same form that it was in February when it failed. There are questions about if maybe they add some amendments to it in an attempt to try to maybe make it bipartisan, cobble together the votes that they need. That seems very unlikely. Then there are other potential approaches where maybe they just try to draft something entirely new. Tim Kaine floated this idea to me, for example, that just says, okay, we want to vote on something that says we uphold the precedents that were set in Griswold and in Casey and in Roe, those specific things that Pete just walked you through. So all of those are options, but it takes votes and the razor-thin majorities in the Senate. This has been the story on everything that Democrats have tried to do, from Build Back Better to voting rights, and definitely now with reproductive rights. They just don't have a wide margin here, and not all of them are on board.
You know, you just saw part of my conversation with one of the heads of Planned Parenthood. I also spoke with folks on the other side of the issue, some anti-abortion activists who have told me they've been, for months, right, talking on the state level, right? They're leaders of their groups working with governors, for example, in preparation for this very moment. You look at some of these gubernatorial races in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, where there are Democratic governors who are up for re-election with Republican state houses, because this is now becoming a state's issue. But what's interesting is that there is now this political question. Why did the leak happen? Pete referenced that. It's unimaginable in his words. It's also in some ways inexplicable because it doesn't seem likely to change the justice's mind. Could it mobilize people ahead of the midterms? That's a question you've heard from the left. Abortion traditionally has not been, as you know, a mobilizing issue for the left. There has been an intensity gap between Republicans and Democrats as far as what abortion does to drive people to the polls.
I also think, though, and I've been asking lawmakers this for months, frankly, because this is the issue that I regularly report on, both through the lens of Congress and also just in stories that I do about women and the access that they have in this instance to reproductive care. But I think the larger question that I've been asking is Democrats for years, and you and I have been on the campaign trail covering this, have told voters, elect Democrats so we have big majorities and we can do all of the things that we need to do on a policy level to shore up access to Roe and then a whole slew of other policy items. They have majorities now in both houses of Congress. What I keep asking is, are voters just exhausted? You see enthusiasm gaps here between Republicans and Democrats already. Republicans are more energized for the upcoming midterms. I'm wondering if this issue, because it is so emotional for voters, if Democrats are just tired and they look at Democratic lawmakers and say, we gave you the majorities that you asked for and you're still not shoring it up. There is a concern, though, still, and I've talked about this with Republicans today, who worry that maybe this is going to be the galvanizing issue for Democrats. And you'll notice that when Republicans have been talking about this issue today, yes, they have touched on the substance of what's in this draft opinion, but they have mostly focused on the leak.
Talk to me more about that, because this is something that some conservatives have been fighting for literally decades, Hallie, right? Yeah. I mean, this is a huge, huge issue, and I've been out in the field and talked to people about this, you know, for many Republicans. But yet today, you know, we look at, for example, Senator McConnell, and it seemed like he was redirecting questions away from the substance of what we saw to the leak itself.
Exactly. I mean, he was even asked today, and I asked Senator Lindsey Graham this too, if Republicans take the majority in the Senate, do you think that they should push for legislation that codifies whatever the ultimate Supreme Court decision is here? Graham said no, said maybe, you know, he kind of hedged, and McConnell didn't even want to touch that. He said it was putting the cart before the horse. So Republicans aren't necessarily relishing this cultural moment because it's such a hot button flashpoint here for the upcoming midterms. Instead, they probably feel, and you're seeing it in their statements, that it's better to just focus on the leak itself and the larger politicization of the court. It's also important, though, and I'm so glad that you say this is something that Republicans at the state level have been working towards for years, because that's why we're here. Laws in places like Mississippi, Missouri, all of these places that put in place these very restrictive bans, they did them with an eye on the Supreme Court. They wanted it to be elevated to this level because they wanted the ultimate referendum to come down 49 years after Roe on whether or not it would be constitutional. This is the moment that all of that work is culminating in. Democrats have been doing it too, but certainly for Republicans and anti-abortion activists, this is the moment that all of that grassroots work has been for.
Hallie Vitale live on Capitol Hill. Hallie, thanks. You may know at home that our bureau, where I'm sitting right now, is pretty close to Capitol Hill. Like, I can look over and see where Hallie was standing, basically. You can also see the court, right? Because the court's right across the street. What we've seen today have been a lot of people. Overnight, we saw this, too, showing up, right? People demonstrating on both sides of this. Anti-abortion advocates, abortion rights advocates, too, including where Ellison Barber is. She is joining us now. You see her live there at a protest that's just getting started in New York City. Ellison, talk to us about what you're seeing.
Who is actually doing the real work.
Hey, Hallie, let me just let you see some of what we're seeing here. The size of this crowd, the signs tells you exactly why they are here. They are beyond upset about what appears to be happening at the Supreme Court, and they have come here to make their voices heard. We have been speaking to people here just about their initial reaction to seeing that draft opinion, and what we have heard time and time again is that people here, they felt scared, they felt confused, even though in some ways they were expecting this, they were still shocked. I want to talk, if I can, with a minute with Ariana here, who came here to protest, came here to be here today. Walk me through why it's important for you to be here today and what you think you can do, what you think should happen next if the Supreme Court does in fact move ahead with overturning Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we can do is we can continue to be vocal in our communities. We continue to support local abortion clinics. We can continue to advocate for our rights. You can physically show up. You can show up with your money. You can show up with your influence. You can show up with your vote. I think right now, ultimately, it is in the court's hands. However, we have the responsibility to show up for our local communities. And so what that means is figuring out who you can support in your local community. Come to events, learn. If you don't know, use Google, ask questions. And yeah, I think that's all about the power of community right now. We can't really rely on our politicians in our court at this point. So we have to show up for one another in this localized way.
Thank you for talking to us. And again, Hallie, if we keep walking just to show you how dense and how packed this crowd is, one thing to keep in mind is in New York, in 2019, they passed the Health Reproductive Act, which really solidified access and rights to abortion in this state. That being said, when you speak to people here, even if they think they will still have access to abortion in this state, regardless of what happens at the Supreme Court, right now they tell us two things. One, they think this is a slippery slope. And while that may be the case initially, they're not sure if that will be the case long term. They're also worried about what this means for other legal precedents that have been centered around the right to privacy and the 14th Amendment. They also say, regardless of what their rights might be in this state, that it matters what's happening to women in Mississippi and other states as well. Hallie?
Ellison Barber, in the thick of it there for us in New York City. Ellison, thank you. You've heard from folks on the other side, too, in this show, people who say that anti-abortion activists have been fighting for this for years. We're going to talk more about it coming up later on in the show. But for now, let's turn to the war in Ukraine, where today we heard President Biden really hit on the need to fight back against Russia. He said it down in Alabama at a manufacturing plant, basically a facility, a factory that makes Javelins, these anti-tank missiles that Ukraine needs. Here's the president.
I urge the Congress to pass this funding quickly to help Ukraine continue to succeed against Russian aggression. This fight is not going to be cheap, but caving to aggression would even be more costly.
Officials are saying they just heard explosions in Lviv in the west, and parts of the city there now have no power. And then Mariupol today, two very distinct images coming out of a steel plant there. Some signs of hope as more than 100 people, some of them seriously hurt, were finally able to get out safely. But right after these evacuations, Russian forces attacked this exact spot. The local Ukrainian battalion saying Russians were using armored vehicles, tanks, infantry, even tried to land by boat. They killed at least 2 people, 2 civilians, they think, and hurt another 10. The latest attack really upping the ante to try to get as many people out as soon as possible, especially as a senior U.S. diplomat warns we could see Russia try to annex the 2 regions you see in the red on the right side of your screen, Donetsk and Luhansk, as soon as this month. Cal Perry joins us now. And Cal, we just heard President Biden, get on the road. He shows up at this factory to make this call. We must help Ukraine with more money and more weapons. That is a message that Ukraine has been sending for more than a month now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that some of this military aid is already here on the ground. But nonetheless, it seems like the war is sort of still picking up. We have these renewed airstrikes in the last few hours across the country. At least 6 railway either stations or tracks were hit in and around Lviv, as well as 3 substations. You mentioned the power is out there now. There were strikes on the western edge of the country. There was a strike in the last hour in Odessa. So we're talking about over a dozen rockets fired by Russia in just the past few hours. And so the military need is on multiple fronts. You have a need for anti-aircraft weaponry, missile defense systems, which we should say to our viewers is still functioning here. I mean, a number of these rockets are shot out of the air on their way to their intended target. And then you have, and you showed this map, this intense fighting in the eastern part of the country. And so the Ukrainian president is desperate for as much military equipment as he can get. There is, of course, the military financing. We've talked a lot about that. There is, of course, the sanctions against Russia. But it is the things that were behind the president on the stage, the actual anti-tank rockets that they want more of here on the ground, and they're trying to get them here as quickly as possible, Hallie.
We also saw the UN and Red Cross evacuate more than 150 women and kids from the steel plant today, and then right after that Russian attack, right? I mean, this is a difficult, dangerous, and deadly situation still.
And it is what the International Committee for the Red Cross is supposed to be doing, negotiating a way out for civilians in these cities. And they've been completely unsuccessful until this evacuation. The President Zelensky saying in just the past sort of 90 minutes, at least 154 people were able to make their way out. And so now we will hear stories of survival, of how horrible the conditions were there. But to your point, there are thousands of civilians that remain in and around that steel plant. And there are 100,000 civilians, according to the mayor in Mariupol, who are still in that city. And we know that this is the front edge of the Russian advance. We know that this is where the worst violence is taking place, where civilians are being targeted. And to your point, we had a successful window open, and then right after those civilians got out, renewed shelling by Russian forces on that area. It just speaks to the level of mistrust between the two sides, Hallie.
Cal Perry live for us there in Kyiv. Cal, thank you. Today you have the State Department putting more pressure on Russia, too. Why? They're saying that Brittney Griner, the WNBA star, she is considered now, quote, wrongfully detained, in their view, by the Russian government. Why am I emphasizing those 2 words? Why do you see them wrongfully detained? Because they mean something, not just semantically, but from a policy perspective, too. Up until now, the U.S. had stopped short of actually going there, of actually putting Griner in this wrongfully detained category. Officials instead said they'd been focusing to make sure she had access to services from the consulate, for example, while she was held behind bars in Russia. But what this new categorization means, again, wrongfully detained, it means the U.S. is about to get way more aggressive, it seems, to try to get her out. Her case is now going to be handled by a special envoy who specifically deals with hostage situations. Remember, Griner was arrested back in February at a Russian airport on drug charges after officials there found vape cartridges with oil from cannabis. Carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Let me bring in Katie Beck, who's joining us with more on this. And Katie, we've been on this story from the start here on this show. She's now been in Russia detained for 75 days. Pragmatically, from like a functional, concrete, on-the-ground level, what does this new classification mean for her?
Well, I think what the new classification means is that the U.S. is not going to sit idly by and let the Russian court system play out, which is what they were planning to do prior to this designation change. Now, we don't know exactly why the timing of this change occurred. The State Department has not said why they decided to switch her to wrongfully detained. But what we do know is that the highest levels of government have to approve that. The Secretary of State himself actually has to sign off on that designation. And there are 11 criteria. Any one of them could qualify her. Some of them, are actual innocence. illegitimate holding, things like that are part of these criteria, any one of those 11 can classify her as wrongfully detained. We don't know which one of the 11 it is or why it is now that they chose to classify her as that, but certainly an indication that aggression is going to be stepped up on the U.S. front. They are not going to simply let the process play out. I think there had been some hope that maybe there would be an understanding of sorts. She does have a legal representation there, and she has a family here who has been very cautiously vocal about her case, I think because they were hoping perhaps, diplomatically something would get resolved. Right. It seems now that they have given up that path and that they are going a different route, which is to have the U.S. fight for her release actively rather than sit passively by and see what the Russian courts decide to do.
When you talk about a family that's fought actively for the release of somebody they love, you look at Trevor Reed, right? Released just a few days ago, an American who was freed from Russia in this prisoner swap. There's also been a lot of attention on Paul Whelan. He's another
Absolutely.
American. Oh, I'm sorry. No, go ahead. I was just going to say, the only thing I was going to say, Katie, is that Paul Whelan is still in Russia, and now tomorrow you have, and I'm going to be talking with them tomorrow, you have members of the Whelan family, member of the Reed family, all showing up for a protest here in Washington to try to get these people released.
Right, and these sentences are incredibly stiff. She's facing 10 years behind bars in a Russian prison if she's convicted. But so this is not something to take lightly. I think they know that, and I'm sure they are encouraged by seeing Reed's case and others. The timing of this does seem as though there's momentum behind others getting released. Perhaps that had a factor here, but I think at the end of the day, this is certainly sending a signal to Russia that the United States is not going to just have good faith in your court system and wait. We're going to go after her and try and get her home.
Katie Beck, I'm so glad to have you on this. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with me on our satellite signal delay, too, as I'm yapping and yammering from here in D.C. Appreciate it, Katie. So not too long ago, actually a couple hours before we came on the air, you had the CDC saying something that seems like not surprising from the CDC, that if you're about to get on any kind of public transport, if you're about to get on a plane or train or a bus or whatever, they say you should keep your mask on. It applies to anybody over the age of 2, given where we are right now with COVID, future protections, et cetera, future projections, rather, et cetera. But here's the thing. This is a recommendation from the CDC. They are restating its recommendation. This is not, so far as we know, a requirement, right? Because remember, that mask mandate on planes, trains, and buses on the federal level has been lifted. A Florida judge struck down that mandate a couple weeks ago, leading the TSA to say it wouldn't enforce mask wearing anymore. The CDC then said, hey, Justice Department, can you appeal this decision? Erica Edwards is here with me now to get into this. And I think it's important to say, Erica, this is a recommendation from the CDC. They're saying you should do this. This is not the administration coming out and saying you must do this, right? So what difference might this make?
Not much, actually. I mean, just as you said, this has long been CDC's recommendation that people wear masks on public transportation. It was, in fact, the mandate that was struck down. Nothing really has changed with their guidance. So really what it's going to come down to is your personal risk assessment, whether you feel it's necessary for you to wear a mask. Are you at particular risk for COVID complications? Do you live with an elderly adult or someone with a weakened immune system? Those situations might merit keeping those masks handy, especially if you were on a very crowded train, bus, or airplane. Hallie?
Erica Edwards, thank you for that breakdown. Appreciate it. Coming up here on the show, a sheriff's office in Alabama confirming a corrections officer had a special, their word, not mine, special relationship with an inmate before they both disappeared. Now, her colleagues are telling us they're stunned, they're shocked, they're devastated. Sam Brock is looking into what's being done to find him. Plus, it's not California dreaming, but California shrinking. Why officials think more people are leaving the Golden State. Alabama deputies are confirming today that a murder suspect and the corrections officer who may have helped him escape had a relationship, a special relationship, in the words of the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Department, confirming that corrections officer Vicky White communicated outside her work hours with Casey White. Inmates say he got privileges like more food, more attention. The two of them vanished Friday, the very day that the officer was set to retire. Even though her mother, who she lived with, told NBC News her daughter never mentioned she was retiring. Now she's apparently on the run with Casey White, who is serving 75 years for a series of violent crimes, is also facing murder charges. Sam Brock joins me now live with the latest. I know I'm asking you the question that everyone's asking. Where are they? What's up with this investigation, Sam? It's been days.
To quote the sheriff, if I knew where they were, I would not be talking to you right now. So obviously, everybody, Hallie, is a little bit perplexed over this. And I saw the air quotes with the special relationship, because also there's been two major developments. One of them earlier today was the confirmation of a special relationship. What does that mean? You know, you highlighted a couple of things that the sheriff told me earlier, which is that more food for Casey White, perhaps that Vicky White was seeing him outside of her normal work hours. But also, I spoke with a former inmate who had a close relationship with Vicky White and said they were corresponding over letters, or really kiosks, because the letters were digitized. That's according to him. The sheriff would neither confirm nor deny that. But there was a second major development today, which was the release of the vehicle, a 2007 Ford Edge. Hallie, I want to hit upon this real quickly for a second, because apparently police could have confounded their pursuit by miscommunication. A local police department put this picture of the car out a day early. They had it pinned yesterday, was not supposed to be distributed yet, but it was, and they're worried that these two escaped. Now, a felon and corrections officer saw this alert and switched cars.
Okay, couple of questions. First of all, I put that in air quotes, Sam, not because I'm being snarky about it, but because I want to indicate to our viewers I am quoting. I'm not calling it a special relationship. They're calling it a special relationship. But also, when you talk about these letters in this kiosk, the prison would have records of that, right? Communications between Vicky White and Casey White?
Presumably they would have certainly records of any sort of written communication. Also, though, I asked what would a relationship be like in the setting of a prison, and what the sheriff said was it is very unlikely there was a physical relationship. Everything that they are obtaining at this point is coming from video surveillance. So really the implication is it was an emotional connection, and then the question becomes for how long, because this was not the first time back in late February that Casey White came to this jail. He had been there in 2020 as well, so the possibility exists, Hallie, this has been going on for a couple of years, not a couple of weeks or months, which would maybe explain a little bit more about it. But we're talking about a corrections officer who was the employee of the year 4 times in 7 years, beyond squeaky clean, in the words of the sheriff. And here we are today.
And you talk with somebody who knew her, right, who knows her, that's totally stunned by this.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. An inmate who told me he was totally perplexed by this based on his own interactions with Vicky, that she was such a stickler for the rules, she wouldn't allow him to get cigarettes in jail. Here are his comments.
Would have never, ever expected this out of her in a million years.
I think she maybe was thinking that they were going to have a relationship. He's playing her.
We all are of the opinion that we'll never see her again. That's what we fear.
One other weird little clue here, Hallie, is the fact that Vicky sold her house a couple of months ago, or really I should say at the end of April, for $95,000. The projected value of the property was $260,000, begging the question, did she need cash so quickly that she had to just sell it for a discount? That's another part of this investigation.
Sam Brock, live for us. Remaining on this story, Sam, we'll see if we chat with you tomorrow and what the headlines are on that, if there's any developments. Appreciate it, friend. Thanks. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1. Vice President Kamala Harris has tested negative for COVID now after taking some antiviral medication. She's been cleared to get back to the White House 6 days after she tested positive, but following CDC guidelines, she's apparently still going to wear a mask in public. Number 2, a spokesperson for the New York State Attorney General's office says former President Trump's motion to stay a contempt order has been denied. What does that mean in plain English? His attorneys had asked this New York State Appeals Court to press pause, basically, on this $10,000 a day fine because he was found in contempt. Trump has owned the former president has owed the fines since April 26. So he's been paying $10,000 a day since then as part of a civil investigation into his presidency. Number 3, California's population dropped again in 2021 for the second year in a row since the pandemic. It's still the nation's most populous state, but 100,000 people left last year, putting California right back where it was in 2016. Experts say the state is facing a, quote, economic stagnation with the increased cost of living. Number 4, JonBenet Ramsey's father wants an outside agency to take over DNA testing of his daughter's still unsolved murder. I'm sure you remember this. The 6-year-old found dead in her family's home in Boulder, Colorado, nearly 25 years ago. Her death was ruled a homicide, but nobody's been prosecuted. Her father says now that he wants DNA evidence that was never tested before to be transferred away from police to a different agency. Number 5, Black China getting no damages in her defamation case against the Kardashians. We told you about this last week. She claimed the family lied about her allegedly attacking ex-fiancé Rob Kardashian, saying that those claims damaged her career in TV. She'd sued for $100 million, but an L.A. jury ultimately sided with the Kardashians. Coming up, we're going back to the big story here out of Washington. What happens if Roe versus Wade were to be struck down? Abortion laws, well, state to state, they look a little bit different, and that's where trigger laws come into effect. We're looking at what that might mean for women in this country after the break. Culture wars could shape elections this year like never before, even in really local school board races. We're going to have more on that in tonight's backstory behind the scenes. But first, what we started the show with, that leaked draft opinion from the Supreme Court that if it's finalized, if it actually goes into effect, would overturn Roe versus Wade. This is such big news. We wanted to talk about it a little more because there's a lot of angles to this. Keep in mind, this is just a draft. It's not the final opinion. Abortion rights activists have sounded the alarm because for many, they believe a lot of states would restrict or outlaw it, and that could have a big effect on people who couldn't cross state lines, couldn't afford to cross state lines to get an abortion. Of course, anti-abortion advocates are preliminarily, at least, celebrating this, something they've fought for years for. Watch.
We won't lose the right to choose.
If the landmark 1973 Supreme Court decision that gave people across the U.S. the right to choose is indeed overturned, Planned Parenthood says more than 36 million could be left without abortion access because 26 states would probably restrict or even ban it altogether, according to the Guttmacher Institute, which supports abortion rights. It would happen in some states faster than others because 13 of them have so-called trigger laws, which would make abortion illegal if the court overturns Roe versus Wade. The move may come at a high price for those who cannot afford to travel to another state for the procedure, like younger people and single people and those in minority communities who historically have had abortions at a slightly higher rate. While a decision overturning Roe would reverse access to abortion for many, there are more options for those looking to perform the procedure safely than there were in the 1960s. Aid groups and companies are already stepping in to fight state bans. Just this week, according to a message seen by Reuters, Amazon told its staff it'll pay up to $4,000 in travel expenses to cover medical treatments, including abortion. NBC News has reached out to Amazon to confirm this, but haven't heard back. The company's decision follows similar reported moves made by Apple, Levi's, Citigroup, Yelp, and more, according to Bloomberg. While the decision that may overturn Roe could come any minute, likely in late June or early July, abortions would not become illegal right away in some states. That process could take several months in places where it is likely to be banned. The U.S. would join just 3 countries that have tightened abortion laws in recent years: Poland, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. According to the Center for Reproductive Rights, 59 countries have expanded access since 1994. So you probably get it by now, right? If this is overturned, the whole thing of what happens with abortion access goes to the states, individual states and their legislatures. 26 of them seem certain or likely to ban abortion if the law is struck down. But 13 states, 13 of them, you see them here, have passed trigger laws, meaning boom, like a snap, right? Almost as soon as Roe is overturned, if that happens, those laws restricting abortion access go into effect. Some of them have different exceptions for life of the mother or in the case of rape or incest. Texas is one of those states. Remember, Texas passed the so-called heartbeat bill last year. It bans abortions after roughly 6 weeks, right around the sign of a fetal heartbeat. It's a heartbeat law. That trigger law in Texas, right, their trigger law would take effect 30 days within a month after the Supreme Court overturns Roe. If that happens, it would make performing abortions a felony. Texas state lawmakers today divided on whether people in their state would agree with this kind of decision from the court. Watch.
This is extremist politics, yet again playing into extreme national narrative that does not represent the people of Texas.
I think it's what folks in Texas have been hoping for, to the extent that we have viable life with a heartbeat. It deserves the protection of the U.S. and Texas Constitution.
The person, the tall individual that you just saw there on screen is our own Garrett Haake, who is standing outside another state legislature's dome here for us this afternoon in the capital of Austin in Texas. And Garrett, this is an interesting case study, right, what happens in Texas, because it already has what is considered the most restrictive abortion law in the country, right? If the Supreme Court were to overturn Roe, what would that mean?
Well, Texas's trigger law would go into effect 30 days later, as you said, banning abortion outright with the only exception to save the life of the mother. No exception for rape, no exception for incest. And it would criminalize the act by a doctor here. You know, part of what makes SB 8, the abortion law that's currently in effect here in Texas right now, so notable is that it outsources enforcement largely to private citizens. It even provides what critics say is a bounty for information on people who get abortions or who help them get abortions. That would become unnecessary in a Roe-less United States where Texas could ban the procedure outright. And, Hallie, it's worth pointing out, an outright ban is not particularly popular in Texas. There's a lot of available polling here that shows a majority of Texans prefer keeping at least some access to abortion rights here in the state. But the state legislature has acted. Governor Abbott has signed this bill, and it is waiting to go in effect if and when that decision comes down from the Supreme Court.
Okay, so you've talked policy, but can you talk about the political fallout piece of this? Because I had a conversation today with somebody who was involved in the anti-abortion space, one of the advocacy groups. And the point that was made was, well, look at, because we were talking about, does this mobilize people ahead of the midterms? Because there's been that discussion on the left. You have some Democrats who are saying, hey, this might actually get more people. Former President Barack Obama today in a statement saying this should be a call to action, essentially show up. Elections have consequences. But on the other side of this fight, it was cited where you are, Texas. Look what's happened there, right? There was some discussion of would the heartbeat bill turn into such a sort of galvanizing issue in Texas. Has that panned out?
Well, we're going to find out. Any minute now, actually, we're expected to see a rally start on the grounds of the state capitol behind me by pro-abortion rights activist Beto O'Rourke, who's running for governor of Texas, has planned a big rally, what he hopes will be a big rally in Houston on Saturday. Abortion rights advocates would like to try to galvanize the people of Texas around this issue. It has been historically difficult to do so, and I can tell you from my Capitol Hill reporting role, generally speaking, issues around the judiciary have always motivated Republican voters more so than they have Democratic voters. But this one may be different. Roe is such a big part of so many people's lives, so many women's lives. And you think about the suburban women who've been a key part of the Democratic coalition, especially since 2018 in fast growing suburbs around places like Austin, North Texas, the Dallas burbs, the Houston suburbs. I mean, those are the voters who, you know, helped Joe Biden get elected, helped some Democrats take back some House seats in 2018, who maybe kind of deflated or felt like kind of the fight was over after Trump lost. Democrats, if they have any chance of reversing some of these measures, like here in Texas, they're going to need those voters engaged. And whether that engagement starts now or whether it happens closer to November, I think will be the big challenge for Democrats. Keep people involved and fired up over this issue if indeed they're going to be successful on it.
Real quick, Garrett, can you keep your congressional correspondent hat on? What are the chances then that there will be some national push if Republicans take both the House and the Senate to codify essentially the overturning of Roe? Democrats are talking about codifying the protections in Roe. They don't have the votes. Could Republicans do the opposite and put something in place on the federal level, right, that would restrict abortion access?
They absolutely could, Hallie, and this has been one of the few Democratic arguments you might hear for keeping the filibuster in place. This cuts both ways. There are many Democrats right now who would like to see the filibuster removed so that Democrats could potentially codify the protections in Roe. Republicans have warned there's not a lot of kind of big national issues that they would want to address if they could do so with a clear, simple 50-50 majority in both chambers. This is one of them, and so it's not hard to imagine a Republican House or Republican Senate and perhaps a Republican president after 2024 trying to do exactly what you described.
Garrett Haake, live for us in Austin. Garrett, thank you for joining us for the conversation. Appreciate it. Coming up, school board elections are becoming really important in some of these small communities. In some places because of the whole culture war ethos surrounding these elections. In tonight's backstory, we're going behind the scenes on how this issue is playing a big role in the state we just left, Texas. Plus, bad behavior on planes means big consequences. The punishment handed down to a guy from Virginia. Next in tonight's Local. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Midwest Bureau, a Missouri man whose death sentence was overturned 3 times is set to be executed tonight. Carmen Deck was sentenced to death in 1998 for killing a couple in Missouri while robbing their home. He would be the 5th American inmate to be executed this year if his lethal injection goes ahead. From our Southeast Bureau, an Oklahoma judge has ruled a lawsuit seeking reparations for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre can go on. The massacre happened more than a century ago when a white mob killed hundreds of black people in one of the country's most prosperous black business districts. The 3 survivors left from that deadly racist rampage are now more than 100 years old and could potentially see some measure of justice in their lifetime. And out of our D.C. Bureau, a Virginia man who tried to open a plane door while it was descending was sentenced to a year behind bars. This guy's getting a year in prison. He breached the door on a United flight to Pensacola last year, but he was stopped by an off-duty federal marshal. The 30-year-old now faces a year in prison and a $7,500 fine. Time now to get the backstory, our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. You've got this weekend school board elections happening in Texas, and some conservative candidates, they've been raising a ton of money, thanks partly to some culture wars that are dominating a lot of the races there. It's a big issue we've seen in the headlines a lot lately, and it really got its start back in May of last year. I don't want to say got its start, but maybe say picked up steam nationally when 2 candidates running in opposition to a school diversity plan won seats in Southlake with hundreds of thousands of dollars backing their efforts. These campaigns we're seeing now, in many ways, seem to be modeled after that. An NBC News review of school board elections in 20 suburban Texas districts found that more than 40 candidates running campaigns focused, at least in part, on issues like race, gender, and sexuality in schools. Those candidates say they want to protect, their words, their kids from that. For some of them, the fight seems to be going fairly well so far. Some are getting endorsements from state Republican officials and support from newly formed political action committees. In one extreme example, a conservative school board candidate raised more than $160,000 for his campaign in Austin. That's a lot of money for a school board race. Others haven't raised as much, but the numbers are still pretty interesting. You've got a pair of candidates outside Dallas raising more than $47,000 combined for their campaign. That's 7 times more than what people raised the last time 2 seats were up for grabs 3 years ago. Mike Hixenbaugh has reporting on this extensively since last year with his reporting partner, of course, Antonia Hilton. Mike, we're so glad to have you on the show for the backstory, if you will, the behind-the-scenes look. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You have talked with a lot of these candidates running to be on school boards. You've gotten into how much support they're getting from different PACs, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about the research that went into this, how you went about advancing this story?
Yeah, well, so as you mentioned a year ago when Antonia and I covered the election in Southlake, which was one of the first times nationally where these candidates running on an anti-critical race theory platform won, that was big news. Flash forward to this weekend, and that issue, along with these issues around library books and how schools teach about gender, they have infiltrated basically every suburban school board race in the state of Texas. And I know this issue is in the news a lot, but based on the amount of messages I've received and the conversations I've had, I don't think people fully appreciate how much this issue has infiltrated and taken over local school board elections across Texas and you know, all over the country as well.
You've also said there's so much more on this. There's too much for one story here. Talk to me about what thread you're going to pull next here.
Well, I mean, it's overwhelming. I did a survey, as you mentioned, of 20 school board races across the state. There are 1,200 school districts in Texas, and the vast majority of these races aren't getting any media coverage at all. And this was a little bit like for a reporter, you know, shooting fish in a barrel. I could just call up school board candidates in any suburban race in Texas and ask them, are these issues coming up? And they clearly are. And then ask them, how is this affecting your race? And candidate after candidate, they're talking about the amount of money flowing into these elections, the amount of personal attacks. You know, this whole issue of where some on the right are accusing anyone who supports LGBTQ rights or talking about those issues in schools, the accusation that those people are trying to sexually groom kids. Well, that has become, in some ways, the cost of entry for running in school board races in Texas. If you're a candidate who supports diversity, equity, and inclusion programs or talking to kids about LGBTQ issues at school or having that be part of the curriculum, all over the state, people who are in those positions are being accused of being a pedophile sympathizer or a predator. And it's having a toll on people.
And listen, I was For many years, I was a local reporter. I covered a lot of school board races, right? A lot of issues in school boards. This is very different than what it has traditionally been, right? The amount of money going into these races, as we talked about comparatively, even in these same districts in Texas, when you looked just a few years ago, there are big differences here. Are you surprised to see what some activists have called the sort of South Lake playbook? You and Antonia have done so much reporting on South Lake. Are you surprised to see how far that has gone since some of that reporting a year ago?
Yeah, I don't know if surprised is the right word. I am amazed, okay. Still, because as you look across Texas and the country, you can see the playbook playing out in district after district, and it's really amazing how closely they're following it. In South Lake, a group called South Lake Families PAC was formed to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to back candidates. Well, now you look across Texas, there's Lake Travis Families PAC in Austin. There's Highland Park Families PAC outside Dallas. There's Spring Branch Families PAC in Tennessee. There's even a Williamson County Families PAC. There are political action committees forming all over the state and all over the country to support school board candidates, conservative school board candidates, and hundreds of thousands of dollars are flowing into these elections. And it's overwhelming to see how much energy is going into these races that are nonpartisan, on paper at least.
Yeah. Mike Hicksbaugh, it's great reporting. I'm looking forward to seeing what you see this weekend. I think you're going to be shadowing somebody as they're going through one of these candidates this election. So we'll look for you and more of your reporting next week. Appreciate it. Coming up.
Thank you.
Speaking of elections, it is a primary today. Big month of primaries this month. And a lot of eyes right now are on the battleground state of Ohio. What the elections there could say about former President Trump's influence over the GOP. Will they pass the Trump test? Voters in battleground Ohio today, they're heading to the polls to cast some of the first ballots of the 2022 midterm primaries. It is a big month for that, starting today in Ohio. And you know that abortion rights have now become front and center. And in this particular state, the Trump factor is getting put to the test for that wide open Senate seat. Former President Donald Trump has thrown his support behind Republican candidate J.D. Vance. If you recognize his name, you might have read his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. And former Never Trumper, this guy turned Trump supporter. He's locked in a tight race against Josh Mandel, another Trump-supporting candidate, and businessman Mike Gibbons. But a quarter of Republican voters in Ohio are still undecided, meaning their vote today could push any one of these candidates over the finish line. Some of those folks today telling us whether the former president's endorsement actually makes a difference. Here's what they said.
I was initially a Mandel supporter until, obviously, Trump put his backing behind J.D. Vance. I did not find J.D. Vance or Josh Mandel particularly compelling in either sense. I think they're both emblematic of a very negative stream in the Republican Party.
Joining me now is Vaughn Hilliard. And Vaughn, that was you. You were talking with voters. You were at one of the, I look behind you, I guess you're at the J.D. Vance watch party tonight, right? Talk to me about two important things. What we've seen on turnout, we know that's all important, right? And also what the sort of mood is in the room where you are.
I can tell you, Hallie, from the early numbers here of returns, that the turnout is not where it was expected or hoped by these Republican campaigns. Now, you got to take into account the tens of millions of dollars that were spent. There's really 5 key viable candidates in this competitive primary. They've been up and down here, but several of these candidates have invested a great deal amount of money and time and energy, but also there's been the super PACs. The former president was out here just over a week ago campaigning on behalf of J.D. Vance. And so the question is, what is the impact of that lower turnout? I mean, when we're talking about enthusiasm, this is really 2022. These are midterms without Donald Trump on the ballot. Yet he's trying to use these primaries as a way to galvanize potentially his own political ambitions come 2024. And that is where you see in this race so many question marks heading into these final hours before the polls close.
Trump test. Talk to us about it, because this really is. I think a lot of people are watching this nationally, not just because this is such an important, Senate primary and Senate race generally, but because it is a moment when the power of an endorsement from Donald Trump either makes a difference or doesn't. And we heard from a couple people that you talked to today. One of them was saying it made a difference for him. The other, it sounded like he was saying he didn't like either of these two front-running candidates who are Trump supporters.
Right. And, you know, when we're looking at Trump's influence here, he's using these midterm primaries as a way to stay relevant and use his political capital and remain in the ballgame while he's living in Mar-a-Lago in Florida here. But this is just the first contest of several. We're going to be having the Pennsylvania primary coming up, Georgia, North Carolina, looking further down the line, Missouri, Arizona. And the question mark is if he's not able to help these candidates who he endorses get over to the finish line, just how relevant and just how influential is he truly over voters? And that is why J.D. Vance, if he is not able to pull off a win tonight, it'll put a lot of question marks. But I think really there's one candidate that I want to highlight, Hallie, and that would be Matt Dolan. Out of the 5 viable candidates that we're looking at, 4 of them were really running for that Trump endorsement. Matt Dolan, though, said the party needs to look forward instead of backwards, saying he would have certified Joe Biden's 2020 election win. Yet look who is up there and who has a shot tonight, Matt Dolan. And maybe just 25 percentage points is good enough to get somebody a win here tonight.
Vaughn Hilliard, live for us there. I know it's going to be a late night for you, Vaughn, but we'll be looking for headlines from you tomorrow morning for sure. Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for joining us this hour. It's good to be back with you. We'll have a lot more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.